They said grief makes people honest, but what I saw at my husband's funeral was something far more cruel than honesty. The church was already full when I arrived that morning, every wooden pew occupied by relatives, old friends, and business associates of Robert Whitmore. The air smelled faintly of lilies mixed with polished wood, and the quiet hum of whispered condolences filled every corner of the room. I stood near the front, dressed in a simple black morning dress that I had chosen carefully the night before, my hands folded tightly in front of me to keep them from shaking. Robert and I had been married for 37 years, and yet in that moment, I felt like a stranger in my own life, as if the ground beneath me had quietly shifted without warning. People kept approaching me with soft voices and sympathetic eyes, saying things like, "He was a great man," and "You must be strong," but their words barely reached me. I kept my attention fixed on the closed casket, trying to convince myself that I just needed to get through this one day at a time. That was when I noticed her. She did not enter like a guest. She entered like she already belonged there. Victoria Hale. I had seen photographs before, never officially introduced, always dismissed as a colleague in Robert's later years. But there was nothing uncertain about her now. She walked down the aisle in a fitted black dress that was elegant but deliberately attention-grabbing, her posture straight, her expression unreadable except for a thin, controlled smile. Conversations around me slowed, then stopped entirely as people began to notice the shift in energy. She did not sit in the back like everyone else. She walked directly toward the front rows, toward me. I remember thinking in that moment that grief had a strange way of revealing truths people spent years hiding. She stopped just a few feet away from me, close enough that I could see the precision in her makeup, the calm in her eyes, the confidence of someone who had never been told she did not belong. "So this is the famous wife," she said softly, but loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. A few people shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether they were witnessing a misunderstanding or something far worse. I did not respond immediately. I could feel every gaze in the room tightening around us like a net. Then she looked at me with a faint, dismissive smile and added, "You always looked more fragile in person." The silence that followed felt heavier than any accusation. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to remain still. I had learned long ago that dignity sometimes meant surviving moments you never deserved. Before I could speak, she stepped slightly closer, her voice dropping just enough to make her words feel private but not kind. "He spoke about you," she said, "but not the way you think." And that was the moment I realized this funeral was no longer just about saying goodbye. It had already become something else entirely. The silence in the church did not last long. It never does when grief and truth begin to collide in the same room. I could feel eyes still fixed on me after her words settled into the air, as if everyone was waiting to see whether I would break, whether I would respond, or whether I would simply disappear into the floor beneath my feet. I chose none of those reactions. Instead, I remained still, my hands folded in front of me, my posture steady even though my chest felt tight. Victoria Hale did not move away. She stayed close, almost as if she wanted to make sure her presence was fully felt, as if distance would weaken her point. I could hear faint whispers now spreading through the rows behind us, names being repeated quietly, questions forming without answers. That was when I noticed the subtle shift in attention. People were no longer focused only on the casket at the front. They were watching us, watching her, watching me. And somewhere in that tension, I realized she had not come here just to attend a funeral. She had come here to define it. I slowly turned my head slightly toward her, not giving her the reaction she clearly expected, and that small refusal seemed to irritate her more than silence ever could. "You do not have to pretend anymore," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough confidence to cut through the quiet. "Everyone here already knows the truth." I felt a chill move through me at those words, not because I believed them, but because I understood the intention behind them. It was not about truth. It was about control. Before I could respond, a few seats behind us shifted, and I heard the faint sound of someone standing. A man in a dark suit moved closer down the aisle, his expression serious, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere again. I recognized him as James Caldwell, the family attorney. I had met him only a handful of times over the years, always in formal settings, always during financial discussions that Robert insisted remained structured and private. His eyes moved briefly between Victoria and me, as if assessing the situation without needing words. "Miss Hale," he said calmly, his voice controlled but firm. "I think this is neither the time nor the place for personal statements." Victoria turned slightly toward him, her confidence not fading but sharpening. "Personal statements?" she repeated, almost amused. "I am simply acknowledging reality." The attorney did not respond immediately. Instead, he adjusted his posture slightly, his attention shifting toward the front of the church, toward the casket, then back toward the gathered guests. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "Reality," he said carefully, "will be addressed formally after the service." Those words changed something in the room. I could feel it immediately. The subtle curiosity that had been building now turned into focused anticipation. Even Victoria seemed to pause for the first time, her expression tightening just slightly, as if she had not expected resistance in this form. I kept my eyes forward now, not looking at her, not engaging, simply listening as the atmosphere shifted around us. Because in that moment, I began to understand something I had not allowed myself to consider before. This was no longer just a funeral filled with grief and memory. It was the beginning of something that had been hidden for a very long time, and whatever was about to be revealed next would not belong to emotion alone, but to truth that had been waiting patiently beneath silence. The moment the attorney said those words, the entire church seemed to inhale at once and hold its breath. I could feel the shift not just in the room, but in the way people looked at each other, as if everyone suddenly understood that what they were witnessing was no longer a simple farewell ceremony. Victoria Hale did not step back. Instead, she straightened slightly, her confidence returning in a controlled wave, as if the attorney's warning had only sharpened her determination rather than weakened it. I remained still, but inside I could feel something unfamiliar beginning to surface, not anger, not panic, but a growing awareness that I had been standing on unstable ground far longer than I had allowed myself to admit. The organ music from earlier had already stopped, leaving only the soft echo of shifting bodies and quiet whispers spreading through the pews. I could hear fragments of conversations behind me, names of Robert, mentions of business, and questions that no one dared to ask aloud. Victoria finally turned her gaze away from the attorney and looked directly at me again, this time with a colder, more deliberate expression. "You are going to find out very soon," she said softly, almost gently, but there was nothing gentle in her eyes. "Everything you refused to see for years." I did not respond. I simply held her gaze for a moment before lowering my eyes slightly, not in submission, but in restraint. Because I had learned over decades that reacting too quickly often gave others more control than they deserved. Behind us, I heard the faint sound of footsteps again. The attorney, James Caldwell, had moved closer to the front of the church, now standing near the casket with a composed posture that immediately drew attention. He adjusted his tie once, then placed a small leather briefcase on a nearby table. That simple action changed the energy in the room again. Conversations stopped completely. Even Victoria turned slightly, her attention now divided between me and what was about to happen next. I felt a tightening in my chest, not from fear, but from anticipation I could not yet name. The attorney opened the briefcase slowly, carefully, as if each movement carried weight far beyond the physical object itself. He removed a set of documents, neatly arranged, and placed them in front of him. His eyes scanned the room once, steady and controlled, before he finally spoke. "Before we proceed with final respects," he said calmly, "there are legal matters that must be addressed in accordance with Mr. Whitmore's estate instructions." A ripple moved through the audience immediately. I heard someone quietly exhale behind me. Another person shifted in their seat. Victoria's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but I noticed it. I noticed everything now in a way I had not before. The attorney did not look at me yet. He did not look at her either. Instead, he focused on the documents in front of him, as if anchoring himself in procedure rather than emotion. "These instructions," he continued, "were prepared prior to Mr. Whitmore's passing and require immediate acknowledgement by all designated parties present." At that moment, I realized the funeral was no longer about mourning. It had become a threshold, and whatever stood on the other side of that threshold would not allow anyone in that room to remain unchanged. The attorney's words hung in the air like a sealed verdict waiting to be opened. No one in the church moved. as if even the smallest sound might interrupt the moment where truth and uncertainty were about to collide. I felt my own heartbeat slow slightly, not because I was calm, but because something deep inside me was trying to prepare for what came next. Victoria Hale shifted her stance for the first time since this began, her confidence no longer effortless but carefully maintained, like a performance under pressure. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes forward, focused on the attorney as he carefully organized the documents in front of him. James Caldwell cleared his throat once, a quiet professional gesture, before continuing in a steady voice. The following reading pertains to the last will and testament of Robert Whitmore, he said, his tone measured and formal. A soft wave of reaction passed through the pews. I could hear someone whisper behind me, something about timing, something about how unusual it was to do this during a service. But the attorney did not pause. He adjusted his glasses slightly and continued. All prior informal arrangements, verbal understandings, and private assumptions are to be considered non-binding unless explicitly stated within this document. That sentence alone shifted the atmosphere again. I felt it immediately in the way people leaned forward, in the way silence became heavier, more focused. Victoria finally spoke again, her voice lower now, but still carrying an edge. "Then let us stop pretending," she said, not looking at the attorney but directly at me. "We both know what he intended." I did not respond. I had learned in that hour that silence was not weakness when used correctly. It was control without noise. The attorney raised one hand slightly, not to interrupt aggressively, but to restore order. "All parties will be addressed in sequence," he said calmly. Then he opened the first page. I watched his eyes move across the text, and I noticed something subtle in his expression, a slight tightening that only someone trained in legal documentation would recognize. Not shock, not confusion, but confirmation of something significant. He began to read. "To my spouse, Eleanor Whitmore." The sound of my name in that formal context made the room feel smaller, as if every person had leaned in closer without realizing it. I kept my posture steady, though I could feel Victoria's gaze sharpen beside me. The attorney continued without hesitation. "In recognition of shared life, responsibility, and long-standing partnership, the following provisions are hereby assigned." He paused briefly, just long enough for the weight of expectation to build, then continued. I noticed Victoria's fingers tighten slightly at her side. She was no longer fully composed. The certainty she had carried into this church was beginning to fracture in small, almost invisible ways. The attorney turned another page, and I realized this moment was no longer about grief or accusation. It was about structure being revealed layer by layer, and whatever had been hidden beneath years of assumptions was now being carefully brought into the light, not for debate, but for recognition. The attorney's voice continued to fill the church with a steady, controlled rhythm, each sentence carefully structured as if it had been rehearsed long before this moment ever arrived. I stood perfectly still, listening not only to the words being spoken, but also to the reactions forming around them. There was a subtle shift in the air now, something that felt less like mourning and more like revelation unfolding in real time. Victoria Hale no longer carried the same effortless confidence she had entered with. I could sense it in the way her posture had tightened, in the way her gaze no longer remained fixed on me, but occasionally drifted toward the attorney, as if trying to anticipate what would come next. James Caldwell turned another page slowly, his expression remaining professional, but there was a seriousness now that even those unfamiliar with legal proceedings could recognize. "Continuing distribution of assets," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the silence like a precise instrument. A few people in the pews shifted again, and I heard the faint sound of someone exhaling as if they had been holding their breath for too long. The attorney's eyes moved across the document before he spoke again. "To be executed immediately upon reading of this testament." That phrase alone seemed to settle heavily over the room. I felt a tightening in my chest, not from fear, but from the realization that this was not a symbolic reading. This was active, binding, and already in motion. Victoria stepped slightly forward now, no longer able to remain entirely still. "This is not possible," she said quietly, but her voice carried just enough tension to reveal the strain underneath. I did not look at her. I kept my focus on the attorney, because I understood instinctively that reacting to her would pull me back into a space I had already begun to leave behind. James Caldwell paused briefly, then continued without acknowledging her interruption. All previously undisclosed holdings, including financial accounts, real estate interests, and corporate holdings under the Whitmore name, are to be transferred according to the stipulations outlined herein. The words did not come quickly. They came deliberately, each one landing with weight and consequence. I noticed the subtle change in the room again. People were no longer simply observing a funeral. They were witnessing a restructuring of reality that most of them had never expected to see. Victoria's composure cracked slightly now. I saw it in the smallest detail, the way her jaw tightened, the way her eyes narrowed as if trying to force the situation to make sense under her own expectations. The attorney continued, turning another page with careful precision. "Beneficiary designation," he said, then paused just long enough for silence to gather again. When he spoke next, his tone remained steady, but the content of his words shifted the entire atmosphere in the room. I felt it before I fully processed it, a collective awareness spreading through the guests like a quiet shock that no one dared to voice aloud. Victoria finally turned toward me fully now, her expression no longer composed but sharpened by disbelief. I still did not respond. I simply remained seated, my hands steady in my lap, because I realized something in that moment that I had not understood before. The balance of everything I had been told to accept was no longer fixed, and what was being revealed was not just about inheritance or loss, but about control shifting in real time, right in front of everyone who had once believed the story was already finished. The room no longer felt like a place of mourning. It felt like a courtroom that had forgotten to announce itself as one. Every word spoken by the attorney seemed to tighten an invisible structure around the people seated in the pews, as if reality itself was being rewritten in front of them one clause at a time. I remained seated in the same position, my hands still folded, my breathing steady, but my awareness sharper than it had ever been. Victoria Hale stood now, without fully realizing she had risen. I noticed it not because of movement alone, but because of what it represented. The confidence she had carried into this church had fractured into something less stable, something reactive. James Caldwell closed the previous page and paused for a moment that felt unusually long. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, but there was a precision in it that made everyone listen more carefully than before. The remaining provisions outlined conditional authority and restricted access to all joint and secondary accounts associated with the Whitmore estate, he said. I could feel the words settled differently this time. They were no longer abstract legal language. They were structure, boundaries, division. Victoria finally spoke again, but her voice had lost its earlier sharpness. It carried uncertainty now, something she was trying to disguise but could not fully contain. "That is not what he promised," she said, turning slightly toward the attorney, then back toward me, as if searching for confirmation in either direction. I did not answer. I had stopped responding to her because I had begun to understand that responses were no longer necessary. The attorney adjusted the document in his hands and continued. "Any informal financial influence, including previously assumed discretionary control, is hereby revoked unless explicitly documented in this testament." A faint sound moved through the church, a mix between disbelief and realization. I heard someone behind me whisper something about accounts, about business holdings, about arrangements that no one had fully understood before this moment. Victoria's expression tightened further. I saw it clearly now. The first signs of collapse are rarely dramatic. They begin in small adjustments of posture, in subtle hesitation before words form. She took a step forward again, but this time it did not carry authority. It carried urgency. "This is being misinterpreted," she said quickly, her voice slightly higher now. "There were agreements, private arrangements." The attorney did not react emotionally. He simply turned another page. "All private arrangements not formally recorded within the final testament hold no legal standing," he stated. The words were not aggressive. They were final. That distinction mattered more than anything else in the room. I felt something shift inside me then, not excitement, not relief, but clarity. For years I had been told versions of events that I accepted, without question because they were delivered with confidence and repetition. Now, for the first time, I was seeing structure replace assumption. Victoria turned toward me fully now, and for the first time her expression was no longer composed. It was searching, not for dominance, but for stability. "You knew," she said quietly, but there was no accusation in it anymore. Only disbelief. I finally lifted my eyes to meet hers. I did not speak immediately. I simply allowed the silence to exist between us, not as tension, but as truth forming its own space. The attorney closed the document slightly, as if preparing for the next section, and in that moment I understood something I had not understood before. What had begun in this church as grief had transformed into something irreversible. Not conflict, not confrontation, but the public unfolding of a reality that could no longer be controlled by assumption or silence. The church had reached a point where silence no longer felt like respect. It felt like anticipation, heavy and deliberate, as if every person present understood that whatever was being spoken now would permanently alter the meaning of everything that had come before it. I remained seated, but I was no longer simply listening as a grieving widow. I was listening as someone who was beginning to understand the structure of a life I had assumed I already knew. Victoria Hale had stopped speaking entirely. She stood now in a rigid posture that no longer carried confidence, only containment. James Caldwell, the attorney, held the document steady in his hands and continued reading with the same controlled precision. Further clarification of asset distribution includes all previously unlisted corporate shares, investment portfolios, and secondary property holdings acquired during the duration of marriage, he stated. The words did not sound emotional, but their effect in the room was immediate. I could feel it in the way people shifted, in the way whispers failed to form fully before dying out. Victoria finally turned her head slightly toward the attorney, her voice lower now, less controlled than before. "That is not consistent with what I was told," she said. And for the first time, there was hesitation in her tone. The attorney did not respond to her directly. He simply turned another page. "All prior verbal representations regarding ownership or future entitlement are hereby superseded by this legally binding testament," he continued. That sentence landed differently. It was not just information. It was removal. I noticed Victoria's hands now, subtle movement that betrayed her attempt to remain composed. She had entered this space with certainty, but certainty requires stability, and stability was now dissolving in real time. I felt something inside me shift again, not quickly, but with a quiet inevitability. For years I had accepted explanations that were incomplete, not because I lacked intelligence, but because I had trusted the framework they were placed inside. Now that framework was being dismantled piece by piece in front of witnesses. James Caldwell paused briefly, then looked up for the first time in several moments. "At this stage," he said calmly, "all designated parties should be aware that execution of these provisions is not subject to emotional dispute." The wording was deliberate. It was not meant to provoke. It was meant to finalize. Victoria took a step forward, and this time there was no elegance in the movement, only urgency. "You are making a mistake," she said, her voice sharper again, but less controlled than before. Robert would not have allowed this interpretation. The attorney finally looked at her directly, not with emotion, but with professional finality. "This is not interpretation," he said. "This is documentation." The distinction silenced her more effectively than any argument could have. I watched her carefully now, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. There is a moment when someone realizes that influence no longer works, and in that moment their entire presence changes. I could see it happening in real time. She turned slightly toward me again, but this time there was no accusation in her expression, only calculation being replaced by uncertainty. I did not respond. I did not need to, because something larger than any of us in that room had already begun to settle into place. The narrative she had attempted to control was no longer intact, and the truth, once formally spoken, does not require permission to continue unfolding. The atmosphere inside the church had shifted beyond recognition now. What had begun as a moment of mourning had fully transformed into something far more structured, something closer to a public unveiling of truths that had been carefully contained for years. I remained seated, my posture unchanged, but internally I was no longer the same person who had walked into this building earlier. Victoria Hale stood a few feet away now, no longer advancing, no longer retreating, but suspended in a state of forced stillness that revealed more than movement ever could. James Caldwell closed the previous section of the document with deliberate care, then allowed a brief pause to settle over the room before continuing. At this point in the testament, he said calmly, all relevant fiduciary responsibilities are hereby activated without further delay. The phrasing was clinical, but its effect was immediate. I could feel a subtle reaction ripple through the audience again, not loud, not dramatic, but deeply attentive. Victoria finally spoke, but her voice no longer carried the sharp authority it had earlier. It was measured now, restrained in a way that suggested she was trying to regain control through language alone. This does not align with prior discussions, she said, turning slightly toward the attorney, then briefly toward me, as if searching for confirmation from either direction. The attorney did not respond to her emotional framing. He simply turned another page, maintaining his professional rhythm. All prior non-documented understandings are considered legally irrelevant under the executed terms of this estate, he stated. The words were simple, but their implication was absolute. I felt a stillness settle inside me as I listened. It was not relief. It was recognition. For years, I had been living inside a version of events that depended on what was spoken rather than what was recorded. Now I was watching that imbalance correct itself in real time. Victoria's composure continued to fracture in small, but visible ways. Her breathing was slightly uneven now, her posture less controlled, her attention shifting between the attorney and the surrounding guests, as if she were searching for support that was no longer there. James Caldwell adjusted the document again and continued. Effective immediately, all designated assets will transition under the conditions outlined herein, with full legal authority transferred to the primary beneficiary. That sentence changed the atmosphere again. This time, there was no confusion in the room, only realization forming slowly across faces that had not yet fully accepted what they were hearing. Victoria took another step forward, but it lacked direction now. It was not an approach. It was instability expressed physically. There must be clarification, she said, her voice lower, tighter. There are private understandings that were never meant to be ignored. The attorney finally looked up from the document, not with emotion, but with final procedural clarity. If it is not documented, he said evenly, it does not exist within this estate. The silence that followed was no longer anticipatory. It was definitive. I looked forward again, no longer observing Victoria, no longer waiting for her reaction. Something fundamental had already shifted beyond her control, beyond anyone's control in that room. The structure of assumed power had been replaced by something immovable, and as I sat there in that stillness, I understood that what was unfolding was not a confrontation between individuals, but the final correction of a truth that had been waiting far too long to be acknowledged. The final words spoken by the attorney did not feel like an ending, but rather like the closing of a mechanism that had been in motion long before anyone in this room had fully understood it. The church remained completely silent now, not out of respect for mourning, but because everyone was absorbing the weight of what had just been formally confirmed. I sat still, my hands resting gently in my lap, no longer feeling the confusion or uncertainty that had followed me into this place. Instead, there was clarity, not emotional clarity, but structural clarity, as if something previously hidden had finally aligned into its correct position. James Caldwell closed the document slowly, signaling that the reading had reached its final stage. This concludes the execution of the last will and testament of Robert Whitmore, he said calmly. The words were simple, but they carried finality that could not be reversed. A soft movement passed through the room as people adjusted in their seats, as if unsure whether they were allowed to react yet. Victoria Hale stood completely still for a moment, her expression no longer composed, no longer controlled. For the first time, there was no performance remaining in her posture. I saw the realization settle in fully now, not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual understanding that everything she had built her certainty upon no longer held authority in this space. She turned slightly toward the attorney, her voice lower than before, stripped of its earlier confidence. This cannot be the full interpretation, she said quietly, but there was no strength left in the phrasing. James Caldwell looked at her directly now, not with hostility, but with the calm neutrality of someone who has completed a task exactly as instructed. There is no interpretation required, he replied. That sentence removed the final layer of resistance in the room. I could feel it immediately. It was not dramatic. It was absolute. Victoria did not respond again. Instead, she looked around the room briefly, as if searching for something that might restore the version of reality she had expected to find here. But there was nothing in the faces of the guests that offered support, only observation. I slowly stood from my seat for the first time since this began. The movement was small, but it felt significant, not because it was dramatic, but because it was deliberate. I did not look at Victoria. I did not look at the attorney. I simply adjusted my coat, the same coat she had once dismissed so casually, and took a quiet breath. The weight I had carried into this church no longer felt attached to me. It felt left behind in the same place where assumptions had been dismantled one by one. As I turned slightly toward the aisle, I became aware that people were watching not the conclusion of a conflict, but the beginning of something else entirely. Not revenge, not confrontation, but recognition. Victoria remained standing where she was, but she was no longer central to anything unfolding in the room. That realization seemed to reach her as well, because for the first time, she did not speak, did not challenge, and did not attempt to regain control. I began walking slowly down the aisle, each step steady, unhurried, and uninterrupted. Behind me, the church remained silent, holding the weight of what had just been revealed. And in that silence, I understood something that had taken a lifetime to learn. Truth does not announce itself with emotion. It simply replaces everything that was not built on it.